The NTSB has held its first briefing on the Greg Biffle crash. Of course, we didn't get conclusions yet, but there are a few new confirmed details, and they help us better understand the sequence of events. Let's take a look. This is William. Welcome to Black Box Analyst. The biggest update from the NTSB briefing is that investigators were able to recover the cockpit voice recorder.
I can also confirm that our team was able to locate and recover the cockpit voice recorder, the CVR, one of the black boxes from the aircraft.
That recorder has already been sent to Washington, D.C. for analysis. This is an important development. Up to now, most of the analysis has relied on data from outside the airplane. NTSB tracks showed us the flight path, the altitude changes, and how quickly the airplane turned back toward the airport. From that, we could see that the aircraft never really stabilized, and that everything unfolded in a very short amount of time. But NTSB has limits. It shows what the airplane did, not what the crew was dealing with or how they were processing the situation. That's where the CVR becomes valuable. Investigators will be listening for when the problem was first recognized, how the crew described it, and how their workload changed as the flight progressed. They'll also listen for how structured the cockpit remained, whether callouts stayed clear, whether checklists were started and completed, or whether tasks began to overlap as time ran out. And time is a big factor here. This entire flight lasted about 10 minutes. That's a very short window to recognize a problem in a jet, decide to turn back, reconfigure the airplane, and attempt a landing. When timelines are that compressed, even well-trained crews can quickly run out of margin. The CVR helps investigators understand whether this was a calm, methodical return or a situation that became increasingly saturated. One additional point the NTSB raised is whether this aircraft was being operated as a single pilot or two-pilot flight. They've said the Citation 550 can be flown either way, depending on pilot qualifications and exemptions, and that determination is still under review. From an analysis standpoint, this matters less in terms of legality and more in terms of workload. In a fast, unstable return like this, having clearly defined flying and monitoring roles can significantly affect how tasks are managed when time and altitude are limited. At the same time, the NTSB also confirmed that this aircraft did not have a flight data recorder and that none was required for this operation. In case you're wondering why, this Citation II was built in 1981, and aircraft of this size and vintage were not required to carry FDR when they were certified. Those requirements were written mainly for much larger transport category airplanes and were never applied retroactively to light business jets operating private flights under Part 91. So the absence of an FDR here isn't unusual or improper. It's simply a function of the regulations in place when this airplane was built. So what that means is that the CVR is now one of the most important tools investigators have. And it also helps explain another question that came out of the briefing: why there doesn't appear to have been a mayday call. The NTSB confirmed that, at this point, they are not aware of any mayday transmission. They are still reviewing recordings from the frequencies the aircraft may have been using, but so far, no distress call has been identified. They also emphasized that Statesville is a non-towered airport. It's important to be careful with how we interpret that. A lot of people hear no mayday and immediately think that means there wasn't a serious emergency. That's not necessarily true. In fact, in situations like this, the absence of a mayday often tells us more about workload than about urgency. At a non-towered airport, there is no controller actively sequencing traffic or prompting crews. The radio is advisory, not directive. Pilots use it to announce intentions, not to receive instructions. In a fast evolving situation, especially right after takeoff, radio communication often becomes a lower priority. There's a fairly consistent human factors pattern in these scenarios. When something unexpected happens, crews instinctively prioritize three things: flying the airplane, configuring the airplane, and navigating. Those three tasks consume most of the available cognitive bandwidth. Radio communication tends to come after that, if time allows. Now ask yourself this: if the situation is changing rapidly, if altitude is being gained and lost, if the crew is trying to keep the airplane within safe parameters while turning back toward the airport, how much spare attention is really available to key the microphone and declare an emergency? Often, there isn't much. So the absence of a mayday does not mean the absence of urgency. Quite often, it means the urgency consumed all available attention. That's especially true when timelines are compressed, as they were here. The NTSB also said they are not aware of any other aircraft in the area that would have affected the landing attempt. That helps narrow the picture, suggesting this was not a reaction to traffic, but to something developing inside the flight itself or in its immediate environment. And that brings us to the final major update from the briefing, which for the first time moves us beyond data plots and into physical evidence. In the initial analysis, the idea that the aircraft was very low on approach was based largely on NTSB data. We could see altitude, ground speed, and flight path, and it strongly suggested that the airplane was below a normal visual glide path. Now, the NTSB has confirmed that with impact evidence. According to the briefing, the aircraft's first contact was with an approach light stanchion located about 1,800 feet from the runway threshold. After that, it struck additional approach lights, trees, and the airport perimeter fence. Investigators also confirmed that the aircraft hit the ground before reaching the runway and that the initial impact occurred outside the airport boundary. That sequence matters. It tells us that by the time the aircraft reached the approach end of the runway, it was already out of vertical margin. This wasn't a case of touching down hard on the runway. It was an undershoot. The weather context helps explain how that can happen. The NTSB described conditions as visual meteorological conditions, but with important qualifiers. Broken ceilings as low as 1,200 feet, heavy drizzle, 5 miles of visibility, and calm winds. Legally VMC, but visually challenging. In those conditions, pilots often feel pressure to keep the runway environment in sight. That can lead to a subtle, often unconscious tendency to fly lower than ideal, especially during a visual pattern. Drizzle reduces contrast. Broken ceilings create a vertical constraint. Visibility is technically adequate, but the picture isn't crisp. Over time, that combination can tighten the pattern. Downwind legs get closer, base turns get steeper, corrections happen closer to the ground. None of this requires poor decision making. It's a well-documented human tendency when visual cues are degraded but not gone. The choice to return to runway 28 also fits into this picture. With calm winds, either runway would have been acceptable from a wind standpoint. But runway 28 requires more maneuvering to line up, especially when returning from a departure in the opposite direction. It also places the aircraft in closer proximity to approach lighting and terrain that slopes away from the runway. Calm winds remove one variable, but they don't eliminate risk. Geometry still matters. Workload still matters. And in this case, the geometry left very little room for correction. Once the aircraft was low, fast, and close, the margin was already gone. That doesn't tell us why the return began in the first place, but it does explain how the final moments unfolded and why recovery was no longer possible. So for now, what the NTSB briefing gives us right now is clarity, not conclusions. We have confirmation of the CVR recovery, a better understanding of the communication picture, and physical evidence that confirms just how low the final approach was. The cockpit voice recorder will be the next major piece of this investigation, and until that analysis is complete, the most responsible thing we can do is stay anchored to what's confirmed, understand the human factors at play, and allow the investigation to continue. If you have any question or observation, feel free to leave them in the comments. We'll discuss together. I'll continue to follow this case closely as the investigation moves forward. Thank you for watching. Fly safe.